this is 4.1.3 in the hormone section, and this is part E. It's not going to be part E in its entirety, but just explaining perhaps one of the slightly more complex processes. And we're going to do part of this, explain how blood glucose concentration is regulated with reference to insulin, glucagon, and the liver. So you should have already watched part F, which explains how insulin is released from beta cells in the pancreas. And what we're going to do now is have a look at what the impact is of insulin on particular cells in the body. So to begin with, I'm just going to play a little bit of this animation, which has the bloodstream at the top. This represents the bloodstream, and then below the animation it talks about a number of different cells in the body that require or that use insulin to allow glucose to move into the cell. So glucose represented by the red G's and insulin with the blue I's. So we've got liver cells, muscle cells, and adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is just fat tissue, but all these cells require glucose, and they're actually good storage points for glucose. So if your glucose levels are too high in your blood, then the glucose can be stored in these three tissues. What we're going to focus on in this little part is about how the muscle cells actually use the insulin to absorb the glucose, and you're going to see exactly what the insulin does to allow it to have some control over how much glucose enters into the muscle cell. So we're going to focus in just on the muscle cell in particular, and the setup that we're going to use is going to be as follows. So what we have here is, this is the cell membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, the plasma membrane we should call it, of the muscle cell, and this is the insulin receptor on the outside of that, and we can see that in the bloodstream here, this little blue blob that's going to fly towards the receptor is a blob of insulin, and so we'll just allow that to attach. So the insulin attaches onto the insulin receptor, and what that causes to happen is for some vesicles that are within the cell. They're not actually shown on here, so I'm again just going to draw them in. Some vesicles which are within the cell in fact they're in the cell membrane, that would imply they're in the cell nucleus. So we're not going to have them there. Within the cell membrane to move towards the plasma membrane. Now these vesicles have got some special channel proteins built into their walls, which I'm just going to represent with these red lines that I'm adding onto the outside of the vesicle. Now obviously that's not going to move in the animation, but what's going to happen, the arrival of the insulin at the insulin receptor causes these vesicles to move, and they move up towards the membrane of the muscle cell. So they're going to go up and they're going to bind with that membrane. Now these channels that here are glucose channels. So whilst this vesicle is deep within the cell, any glucose that's in the blood up here, which we'll see on the animation in a second, but just for ease of understanding now, I'll just represent with these green blobs. So as things stand, these green blobs can't get their way out of the bloodstream and into the muscle cell. As soon as the insulin arrives, the insulin receptor receives the insulin, it causes the vesicles with their glucose channels to move to the plasma membrane, and then the glucose can then move through the plasma membrane down a concentration gradient through that transporter protein and into the cell. So we'll just watch the next part of the animation. So this shows you the glucose channels now moving to the membrane, and you can now see that any glucose that's in the blood can now bind with those channels and move through and into the bloodstream. So I'm just going to rewind that a little bit. We'll play that again. So remember, this is just focusing on the muscle cells. Liver cells are a little bit different in that they always have these glucose channels present in their membranes, but with the muscle cells, they exist deeper down within the cytoplasm. So channels move to the edge, and the glucose can make its way in. So you can just imagine a scenario where there wasn't any insulin in the bloodstream, then there would be no insulin received by the receptor, and then these vesicles would stay within the cell, within the muscle cell. And so even if the glucose then tried to get into the cell, and they wouldn't be able to, because there wouldn't be any channels there. One other important point is just, I'm just going to write this down on the right hand side, is the name of this channel. Sorry, not of the channel, of the transporter that's within in the wall of the vesicle, and it's called the GLUT4 glucose transporter. Just another name for you to learn, I'm afraid. So the GLUT4, so that's what's represented by these red lines here. That's the transporter that's within the membrane of those vesicles, which allows the glucose into the cell. So the effect of this would be to raise the glucose levels within the cell and reduce the blood glucose levels. And remember, you need to be specific in your exam answers as to where the glucose levels are being changed when you're talking about different parts of the body.